meaningful.
So we'll probably go ahead and get started. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. My name is Ben Travers. I'm a Ward 5 resident, now live on South Crest Drive as of a couple of weeks ago, but lived on Home Avenue before then for a number of years. I'm a member of the Ward 5 NPA Steering Committee, and I'd like to introduce our other steering committee members as well before we begin. We have Andy Simon over here. Joe Derry is here, Lucia Campriello, Scott Pavek, Nate Lantieri, and Billy Clark. I think I've covered everyone. Did I get everyone there, Joe? I think so. A couple of our steering committee members, the reason why I'm asking that question, recently stepped off. So we do have a couple of vacancies on our NPA steering committee, and so folks are interested in that. We'll be publicizing that opportunity for anyone who would be interested in joining the steering committee. Our NPA normally meets the third Thursday of every month, and we try to touch on a diverse set of issues of interest to many different neighbors. And really the format of those meetings and the agendas, so we take topics in 10, 15, 20-minute segments, doesn't really offer much of an opportunity for us to really dig in on a particular issue. We called this special meeting, though, in response to and as an opportunity to dig in on two issues in particular that have been a big part of a lot of community discussions as of late. One of those is the state of public safety, and the other is the Sears Lane community, which is here in Ward 5. And clearly, I think the special meeting was called for. The attendance in this room is great. It's awesome to see so many people in person, and we're also here on Zoom, and I see 44 participants on there, which is pretty good for an NPA meeting. So thank you all for being here. Before we begin our discussion, and I think discussion is the key word here, we're looking for this to be a discussion and dialogue, and certainly would be open to questions from the public as well as on Zoom. I believe there's a Q&A function on Zoom that folks will be able to use if they'd like to submit questions there. And also say that we did solicit questions beforehand, and we received over 24, 25 questions from the public before this meeting, which again was great to have that feedback from the public going into this. I don't know that we'll be able to get to every question, but I suspect it won't come as a surprise to folks that there were some common themes there, and so we'll try to touch on those. But the intent here is that this be a discussion. Many folks are rightfully passionate about the issues that we're seeking to discuss, and I think it would be remiss of me to not begin this meeting by acknowledging, as we have really as an NPA over the last year and a half in particular, that our nation, our state, our community continues to reckon with long-standing issues of equity and inclusion, and there's still much to do to build a stronger and more just community, particularly for those who suffer from disparate treatment because of the color of their skin or their economic status, or their housing status, for that matter. All are welcome at our meetings, and all viewpoints are respected. This is a safe space, though, and I will say, and unfortunately it's something that we've had to say here over the last year and a half, that we will not tolerate any messages of hate. And I do want to make that clear, that this is a safe space for all viewpoints. Also, I do suspect it will be impossible for us to steer clear completely of this being a policy or political debate, but our intent really is for this session to be more informational and less of a debate. We'd like to focus on the current state of public safety, the current state of housing issues, what the root causes are behind that current state and what resources are available to folks now in our community to address the issues that are there. And to have that discussion, we're really thrilled to have our panelists tonight. And I'd just like to sort of go around and introduce folks. And if you could take a moment to introduce yourself as well. And we have one panelist up on Zoom as well. I should mention thank you to CEDO as well. Bridget, I appreciate your being here. And thank you to Town Meeting TV, too, for coming together on short notice and to get this meeting out to as many folks as possible. So if I could introduce our first panelist, we have Acting Chief John Murad from the Burlington Police Department.
Hi.
Chief, would you like to just say a couple words to introduce yourself to folks?
Sure. My name is John Murad. I am the Acting Chief of Police and have been since June of last year in 2020. I'm happy to be at these again. I made it a practice to go to almost every NPA and once showed up at a very busy one in this end of town where Scott Pavick was concerned that I was going to be here to break it up because it was so overcrowded at the city market. But I just went to them. I loved them, and I really missed having them during the pandemic. And the idea of all of us being here together again is really terrific. The Flynn opened up last weekend and had the same feeling during that big opening event, this sense of everybody maybe finally being together again and turning a corner. But I'm really thankful to be here. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm hopeful that we can have a good discussion about these really important issues.
Thanks, Chief. Just going down the line, Councilor Joan Shannon, our South District Councilor.
Yep, I'm Joan Shannon. I live right down the street. I used to be the Ward 5 representative, and now I represent the South District, which is Wards 5 and 6. So I really thank the NPA and you, Ben, for hosting this kind of forum, which I think is really welcome in the community as we can see. And I know I was on Zoom at the last meeting and there weren't very many people in this room, so it's impressive to see how many people have come tonight.
I agree, and thank you for being here as well.
I don't know if the mics can pick us up with our masks on or how that's working. If that's...
I'm hopeful they are. If folks are monitoring the chat, and if for any reason folks on Zoom can't hear us, if they could drop something there, and then we can do what we can to fix that. Sound is good so far. Thank you, Billy. Chip Mason.
Thank you, Ben. My name is Chip Mason. I am a the Ward 5 City Councilor. I live on Scarf Avenue, where I have lived for over 20 years now. I also want to thank the steering committee for pulling this together because it's a very different format than a city council meeting where we're often, sitting behind a table and many members are looking for more of a discussion only to be disappointingly told that this is not a point for discussion. We're there just to take comment. And I know that many people who come to meetings are very frustrated with that format. So it's nice to have a different format and also to have an opportunity to hear people's thoughts on these issues, which have taken up legitimately are the focus of a lot of council and administration time. So I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the line, we have Professor Stephanie Saguino here wearing her hat as a member of the Police Commission, but I know you've worn a number of different hats in the public safety area over the years, and so thank you very much for being here, Professor, and if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. So Stephanie Saguino, I'm a member of the Police Commission. I joined, I think, just a year ago, last September, and I actually am a former resident of Ward 5. Half of my life in Burlington has been on Pine Street, actually. We moved up to South Prospect, so feel like at home in this neighborhood. And I wanted to just say that I wanted to actually thank you, Ben, for setting the table and the way that you laid out the issues. I think that's really, really generative and can really help us have a productive discussion. And I will just say this about the Police Commission. Many of you may have observed the Police Commission's role has been changing over the last year. And one of the things that we see as our role is to be this intermediary, if you will, between the police department and the community. And I think we're going to be making more efforts to hear from the community and to be able to facilitate that dialogue. So I really welcome this opportunity tonight to hear you all.
Thank you. And turning to this side of the table, Stephen Marshall, greatly appreciate your being here as well. We've had you here to our NPA before to discuss issues related to housing and to homelessness, and appreciate your coming back and joining us again.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try not to be intimidated by the fact that all those folks are over there and I'm over here by myself.
That's not who you started.
That's why I sat over here, too.
Be over here.
No, it was all good. It was a joke. You laughed, right? I would like to introduce Gray Beretta. He's a member of the Sears Lane Homeless Community Camp. And realizing that he was not invited as a panel member, I might, in the course of the meeting, say I will defer to Gray to make a statement, depending on the question and what I think the answer will be. I should say, I'm a member of course, I've been an advocate for the homeless community for 7 years at least, maybe 8, depending on how you count. And now I am proud to call myself a member of the local mutual aid community, which is a community of people who care about other people and care about reducing injustice and inequality and ensuring that services are delivered to all people in some way to help them to survive. And that is the foundation of what my comments will be for tonight.
Thank you, Stephen. Gray, I appreciate your being here as well. I will say that on the agenda, we had also had Councillor Hightower, who's been a member of the Public Safety Committee and as part of the Police Transformation Project. She will not be here at this meeting, and that is in part at least because there are, again, it will come as no surprise to folks, many voices on this issue. Councillor Hightower felt it important for this panel to include additional voices, which I agree is important as well. We also had concern that we have a panel of 7 folks already, and simply the logistics of it would not permit a panel of that size and providing everyone an opportunity to be heard. And so what I would like to say to that end is that we certainly don't see this as being the beginning and the end of the discussion. We would like this to be one part of the discussion. Stephen, we've appreciated having you and other folks from the effort to address homelessness in Vermont here at these meetings. We've had certainly folks from the public safety community as well, and we'll look forward to having another meeting to bring other folks to continue this discussion going forward. So with that said, and again, yeah, Andy.
You want to interview Tammy Buddha?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you very much. We do have one other panelist, right.
Don't feel too
which is
minimized.
Tammy Buddha. Tammy playing a vital role with the street outreach team through the Howard Center. And Tammy, if you're there, if you could unmute yourself and introduce yourself to the room and the folks participating on Zoom. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes.
Sure, hi. I'm the disembodied voice from a computer somewhere, probably. So I am Tammy Bruno with the Howard Center Street Outreach Team. I think I was asked here to kind of speak about like services and resources that are available in general. So I'll do my best to fill in there where I can.
Thanks, Tammy. Appreciate your being here. So, if folks here in the room have questions at any point, if you could raise your hand, and we'll make sure to get to you. Again, if folks on Zoom have any questions at any point, feel free to use the Q&A feature, and we'll be monitoring that. Joe, did you have a question already?
Meeting question.
Yeah.
So I'm right next to the TV. Could you hear back there? Should I turn that up some, or is it fine? Okay, that's all.
Why don't you turn it up a few notches?
Yeah, okay, it was a little quiet. I don't know how this thing works. Huh? Okay.
All right, great. But we will try to get to a lot of the common themes that were raised by folks before the meeting. And again, as I mentioned before, I think obviously a lot of people have passionate viewpoints on a lot of the issues we'll discuss today. And for some of those folks, the answers to some of these questions may seem self-evident. But even for some, the issues that seem self-evident, there's 2 sides to the coin, right? So for some in this room, I suspect they would say it's self-evident that crime has been on the increase over the last year. There's other folks who would say it's self-evident that there's data and other information out there that showing over the last few years that crime has decreased. And so I would really like to start with just sort of the general question of our panelists, and Chief, if I could start with you, if you could speak to sort of through your role, how you view the lay of the land and how crime has increased, decreased, stayed the same, and obviously not all crimes are alike, right? So if you could speak to the lay of the land from your perspective.
Sure, and I'll try to be brief. So overall incident volume, the kinds of things that come in mostly as calls from 911 or from citizens through our dispatch unit, but also sometimes self-generated by officers, incident volume is drastically down over the past several years. And it has gone from averages of around 30,000 to it's going to be in the very, very low 20s this year. And part of that began, obviously the pandemic affected that, but a lot of that decrease precedes the pandemic, and a lot of that decrease actually stems from a reduction in discretionary officer activity. So the diminishment of our car stops alone, and we've reduced car stops in the city by about 80% over the past 5 years, that alone constitutes about half of the total decrease in incident volume. So that's part of it, but obviously another component is that there are fewer calls for service. However, what we don't see is a change in the calls for service that are the most serious. This past year, we created something called a priority response model to address the fact that incident volume was going up again, not as high as it had been, but it had gone up again after a very low point during the pandemic, and we were losing staff at an alarming rate. And so to address that issue, we created a priority response plan where we took our calls for service, the 130 calls for service that we track, and we sorted them into priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3. And all of this is available on our city website. We have a lot of transparency efforts on the city website that you can go to, City of Burlington, the police department page, and then there's something called Transparency and Data, and it shows the priority response plan right there, the kinds of calls, ranks and tiers the calls. What we see is that the decrease has been entirely among priority 3 and priority 2 calls. And priority 1 calls this year are actually higher than they've ever been since 2017. Now, among those priority 1 calls are a range of different things that we would call crimes. Some of them are up, some of them are down a little bit, some of them are alarmingly up. The data that I most recently presented to the Police Commission included the fact that burglary has gone from, it was 86 in 2019, it was 91 in 2020, it's 159 so far this year, and that's year to date as of October 25th when I presented this information to the Police Commission. Stolen vehicles have gone from normally hovering around the high 30s or 40s. We've had 106 already this year. We have more aggravated assaults, felony assaults, than we've had in the past 5 years. Simple assaults, however, are a little bit lower than they have been in some previous years. Higher than last year, but lower than the years that preceded that. So some of this data is a little bit mixed. But overall, what we're seeing is that the priority 1 calls, those most serious types, are higher than they have been. And what's troubling about that is not only that they're higher, but that the per officer available for them is much, much lower. We have gone from having a normal availability of somewhere between, usually in the mid-50s of officers available for patrol on the road, to having fewer than 30. We currently have fewer than 30 officers available for patrol on the road. And that's because our total headcount has to be divided among the airport and our detective bureau and the services there and the road. And the one that actually has no contractual obligation to it is the road, patrol. We have to have a certain number at the airport. We have to have, by contract, a certain number in the detective bureau. And really, that's a minimum number for it to function. And so we generally end up losing officers from the road as officers retire. And we've lost a great number of officers. Now, the good news is that we've come up with a couple of different ways to address that. I presented to the City Council in January of this year a public safety continuity plan that includes bringing aboard unsworn, unarmed officers called community service officers to be able to address some of those priority 3 calls, those quality of life type calls. And hopefully, we're onboarding a number of those. We've hired 2. We have another who is in the hiring process in background, and we have another great one that I just signed his background check for. I'm hopeful that we'll have at least 5 of those by the end of the year, not necessarily solo on the road. 2 will be solo on the road, but we'll have 5 hired by the end of the calendar year, and we will have the full 10 that the City Council allotted us by the end of the fiscal year. We also created these positions through that public safety continuity plan that I put together called community support liaisons, and those are people who have expertise in mental health, they have expertise in substance use disorder, in houselessness and dealing with houseless populations, and they are an incredibly important resource. They've been an integral part of our outreach to the Sears Lane community. They fall under Lacey Smith, who is now the community support outreach supervisor, and they are a really important part of where I see policing going in the city in the coming years, with co-deployments of those kinds of positions with officers, and also with being able to divert more of our calls for service to those kinds of resources. Officers, on the other hand, we've also had good news there, which is that the City Council changed the head count that had been created in the June 2020 resolution. You okay?
I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm like,
The City Council changed the head count that had been authorized in the June 2020 Racial Justice Resolution, which was 74. That was a 30% cut that was made in a moment of great national passion, and has raised it again to what effectively is 87. And so we are well below that 74. We currently have 69 total officers, 65 of whom are effective, and we are working now to be able to hire. We hired our very first new officer in almost 2 years. He's at the academy now. We are looking for additionals. I unfortunately stole him from Tammy because he was a street outreach team member. That's the kind of officer that we want, though, people with that kind of experience, that kind of ethos. So we're hopeful to be bringing aboard more of those. I will lose more officers before I can hire more, though. I have others that are going out the door looking for other opportunities. They don't feel supported in this community. I'm hoping that that's turning around and that we've reached the sort of apex of our pendulum. It's going to hold for a moment once we stabilize with numbers and then swing back towards the middle. But that's the long and the short of it. And I could go on, but I won't.
Well, I mean, we'll come back to it. If you could just wait. Sorry, go ahead. Do you have a question?
I have I live on South Crest also.
Yes.
And I've read lately there's a lot of gun crimes. What's going on?
So that's an entirely different issue, and I mean, I definitely would want to get into that with you. I'm happy to talk to that after. Very briefly, what I'll say is that we track in Burlington gunfire incidents, and we're lucky to be in Burlington where we can track gunfire incidents, which are not shootings. Gunfire incidents are when a gun is discharged in the city limits in a way that is criminal, and we know that it's criminal. Hunting doesn't count, a suicide by gunfire wouldn't count, but it is discharged. We have probable cause that it was discharged and reasonable suspicion that it was discharged at another person or in a reckless manner. In the past years, from 2012 through 2019, we've had an average of 2 gunfire incidents per year. In 2020, something changed, and it changed around the country. And we saw a dozen such incidents in the city in 2020. We've seen 13 so far this year in 2021. I'm hopeful we don't see any more. The country has seen this as well, although in the country they track shootings and actual homicides. We're lucky in that respect. Of those 13 that have happened so far this year, I believe 3 involved people getting struck. But nevertheless, a gun shootout at the Simons, at Winooski and Bank is not something that we want in our community, and we're seeing more of it. What's driving it? I have my suspicions. I'm working on some efforts with federal partners, with the state's attorney, and we've seen a lull in that activity over the past 2 months, which is, knock on wood, good. So I can talk more about it afterwards, but I don't know that that's the topic here tonight.
Great, no,
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And you've touched on some issues there, Chief, that I think we'd like to double back to, like the community service liaisons and other alternative resources that may be available. And you know, like the hiring of new officers, but also keeping in mind that that's probably a multi-year timeline there. And I suspect there's many people here in this room who are thinking more about sort of the here and now, but certainly appreciate that feedback. If I could continue on to the question, just get some different points of view from the lay of the land, Councilors Shannon and Mason, you've lived in, well, I see you raising your hand, Professor Saguino. If I'm happy to turn to you or to them. It'll come to you, I promise. But you know, you've lived in and represented this community for many years, and I suspect you have an interesting point of view on this.
So Chief Murad mentioned that he presented some data, and you can find it on board docs at our meeting on October 26th. He summarizes these data. I want to just add a couple of things to what Chief Murad said. When we look at the priority 1 calls, amongst priority 1 calls are mental health and overdoses. So they're not all crimes per se, they're a lot of social problems. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude, the chief said, correct me, Chief, if I'm wrong, that it was 159 burglaries.
That's correct. And mental health is not a priority 1 call.
Okay, I saw that on the,
It's a priority 2 call.
okay, I saw that on the sheet that it looked like it was priority 1. In any case, there are something like 800 of those calls so far this year compared to, let's say, 159 for burglary. So a lot of the issue with the burden on police officers has to do with these, what I would call social problems. And so it's really welcome to have the CSOs and the CSLs as we hopefully migrate, now that we have the CNA report, to alternative ways of offering public safety. But I did just want to underscore that when we talk about these calls for service, they're not all, many of them are related to social ills, whether it's poverty or addiction or mental health issues. And they require services that I think we're all understanding need to be provided differently than they have been.
Thank you. Counselor Shannon and Mason.
Yeah, I can't really, I mean, the chief, I so appreciate your continued enthusiasm and commitment, and that he gets fired up every day to do this job always impresses me. And I can't really add anything in terms of our crime statistics, but just wanted to share kind of what I hear from people. And it seems that statistics are not foolproof in painting the picture of crime in our community. And what we're definitely hearing from people is that they aren't reporting crime the same way that they used to report crime. There's both a feeling that we shouldn't report crime in some cases, and a feeling that the police are overburdened and we don't want to bother the police in the same way that we used to, so we're creating our own priorities as a community. And there are a lot of things I notice walking around downtown that are just going completely unaddressed by anybody, where there used to be a presence of police in the downtown. Due to the lack of presence of police, there are things happening that would not have happened simply by the presence of police in the past. What I hear a lot about from the community is, and it also is showing up in the statistics, is the great increase in property crime. A lot of bicycle thefts, a lot of car thefts. We've always had some, but that's clearly up by any measure, both anecdotally and demonstrated in the statistics, I would say. And I also want to say that as we, this discussion about defunding the police, I think that it is distressing that, as Stephanie says, a lot of this is the failure of other systems. And I know in my own family, in the middle of the last century, my family members were treated for their mental illness, and that mental illness put other people's lives at risk at times. And they got treatment, inpatient treatment, and came out, worked productively in the community. They were positive contributors to the community. Things would happen, maybe stress. They would need to go back in, get treatment. And that is not available in our community today. And that is an utter failure of our system. And, there's a lot of things that are divisive, but there's also a lot that we can agree on, including police officers. I know don't want to be addressing a lot of the issues. And going back to when Chief Sherling was the chief, we were hearing about these issues. And this is not what police officers do best. So, I certainly look forward to all of the community supports that can be contributed, and we can debate, what the number of police should be, but aside from whatever that number is, we need all these other supports in the community, and unfortunately, I don't think it's really just a matter of money. We don't have the trained professionals in our community to provide the services that our community needs. So we have a pretty low baseline we're working from.
Thank you. And I think we do want to turn the discussion back here over the course of the next hour to questions related to root causes and you know, what's really going on. But before we do that, Chip, I'd like to turn to you. Tammy will then come to you, and then I'd like to pivot to asking Stephen a question. So, Chip.
I would, excuse me, I would echo what my colleagues have said on both sides. I will say, I do somewhat, I know statistics are statistics and it's hard, but anecdotally, I can also report, you know, in my neighborhood and anyone who's reading the Front Porch Forums, I mean, you would read it and think crime is, you know, an epidemic in the South End. And I know, just based on vandalism on my street alone, you know, I'm pleading with my neighbors to report so that the data picks it up. And people simply are not going and filling out the online incident reports. You know, there were over 30 incidents of vandalism on my street over the course of 3 weeks, and other than me calling and telling the chief, nothing was showing up on his system that there even was an incident. And I also work downtown, and I know, you know, we are struggling in our parking garage with a substance abuse issue and a population, and cars being rifled through, broken windows. I'm hearing it every day. You know, I'm in my office, and there's no simple fix. I mean, there's not, and unfortunately, we had a fatality recently in the garage. Someone overdosed. You know, the simple solution that was done is putting up plywood to stop people from going into. That's not a long-term fix. I understand why the landlord did it, but that is not a long-term fix. So anecdotally, despite what the data say on, you know, the lower priority, I mean, and Damrosch today, I mean, we're hearing someone, you know, she left the back door unlocked for 10 minutes in the middle of the day. Someone walked into the house and rifled through on Flynn Ave. That's not, I would say, what we all expect of our neighborhoods. You know, I think we believe them to be far safer than that. And I do look forward to the conversation because I have my own belief in terms of what's driving this, but I know none of us knows. And I applaud also the police commission for there will be a mental health summit coming up that will be discussing some of the intersection of these issues between crime and mental health. But I think a lot of us also recognize this is not an easy solution, and it's often not something the city of Burlington, city council administration, or the police, you know, can solve. Whether it's money or other, it does involve the state, social service agencies, and others to also be involved. And it's hard to amass everyone, you know, into moving in the same direction. And maybe the mental health summit is sort of the first step in doing that, on at least one aspect of that. So thank you for the question.
I see a question here. I do want to turn to Tammy and Stephen, but yeah, go ahead.
So you say the incident reports are down. I call the police department quite often. When the dispatcher is so rude to you that it makes you feel like the criminal, how often are you gonna call? Okay,
Yeah,
it's a serious issue. My neighbor was hung up on by the dispatcher, okay? I was treated like a criminal when I called in with a complaint. It's not acceptable. How long do you think I'm gonna keep calling if I get treated like that?
It's a question that came in from folks before the meeting as well, and so it's certainly something I want to turn back to. And it's not only with respect to folks that are calling into the police, but the question was also presented in the context of, you know, even with lower staffing members, the police department has acknowledged a need to build bridges and to repair relationships with different segments of the community. And so I do think we want to come back to the question of sort of what efforts the police department is undertaking, not only to answer this gentleman's comment, but also with different communities. But we'll come back to that. I do want to give Tammy and Stephen an opportunity to speak here. Tammy, I'm curious from your perspective on street outreach, if you have a perspective to add to this sort of lay of the land question. And in the context of that, I don't know that everyone is familiar with street outreach or what it does. And so if in the context of your answer, if you could speak to what street outreach is, its relationship with the Howard Center, how many folks you have on your team. It sounds like you're down one more per Chief Murad's discussion, but would be interested to hear about that. Two.
We're actually down,
Yeah.
we're actually down 2.
Yeah, we stole a
Not
CSL.
only did one of them become a police officer, but one of them is also one of the CSLs.
Sorry, Tammy.
So we're down 2. But we just hired a new third, and we have a fourth coming on. And the new guy is great. He'll be up and running in no time, and I'm really excited about the guy that's going to be coming on at the end of this month. He seems very promising as well, so I think we'll be up to steam pretty good. What Street Outreach does, we are normally, and we will be again soon, a group of 4 outreach workers. We are looking to expand to be a group of 6 so that we can have increased evening and weekend coverage. We have kind of two main roles. One is to be available to folks who would typically be looking for social services or in need of social services, but perhaps not the sort of individual who would say, well, I think I'll make a few phone calls today and see about treatment, or, so it's a more meeting people where they're at, street level engagement. So to that end, we make sure that we are available and continuously present in the downtown area, so that if people have a question, if they are interested in services, if they are escalated, that we can be available in that moment, and to support people kind of in their daily goal of managing their stress at the best possible level. When we are not doing that, simultaneously, we are available for phone calls from community members, family members, consumers, and the police, who, when they encounter something that is more social work than police in nature, or requires some kind of systems coordination particularly with mental health, will give us a call for assistance. So that's kind of us in a quick nutshell, and being cognizant of time, and there's a lot of layers to it, but that's sort of us in a nutshell. What we have seen, I think that Chief Murad's the data rang very true. That really reflects what we have been seeing as a team. I also, speaking to Commissioner Saguino's notice of the mental health calls, those have certainly, I think, spiked. We can see what kinds of calls come in. It's important to note that any kind of call that is what a community member would think of like as odd behavior, or they don't know what's driving it, sometimes gets flagged as mental health. So, the actual clinical mental health calls might not be that high, but there are within those a lot of substance use, a lot of homelessness, and a lot of mental health or kind of co-occurring things going on. In terms of the crime and safety, one of the reasons why I wanted to be present is that I've been told by many of the folks that we serve downtown in the community that they feel that things have become more dangerous for them to live on the street, that their persons and their possessions are not as safe as they used to be in Burlington, and they've asked me time and again, how do we get our feelings out there? And I've urged them to come to city council meetings, but having this opportunity to kind of voice that for them, I thought I should take it. I think, I don't know who said that they were seeing a lot of things downtown that they wouldn't normally see. I see it myself, and I hear about it as an issue from homeless people and other vulnerable populations who live in the downtown area, and it makes them feel unsafe as well. So I would say that, like you, kind of within some of the vulnerable populations, there is also a perception of an uptick in crime and lack of safety.
Thanks, Tammy. And I actually think that's a great segue for us to turn to Stephen. And Stephen, before turning to you, I think it's important to note that homelessness is not a crime. It's a stigma that some wrongfully apply to those who are without a home. And as Tammy mentioned, right, I think folks in the homeless community are more often victims of crime because of their being in a more vulnerable population. And so I want to be careful. You know, I was concerned coming into this meeting. I didn't want to perpetuate that wrong stigma.
Appreciate that.
By having you here in the greater context of a discussion on public safety. But of course, public safety issues have, you know, been arisen in the context of what's occurred with the Sears Lane community over here over the last couple of weeks, and wanted to provide you and others an opportunity to speak to that. I suppose one of the questions I would have for you, because I doubt, or I don't know how many people have been down to the Sears Lane community and have been in there and have met with folks, and I'm wondering if you can speak to how the lay of the land there, not simply from a public safety standpoint, but generally speaking, has developed and changed over the last year and a half or so.
Oh, I'd be happy to. First of all, I would like to just express my gratitude for Joan's expression, failure of other systems, that we know that the solutions to complex problems are themselves complex. Obviously, mental health is a very significant issue throughout the community for the houseless and for lots of folks who are housed. And a strong social services network is what we need, even if it's difficult to accomplish. I guess what I need to say about the homeless community and how it feels is that I have never met a homeless person who was talking about looking for a place to spend the night who wasn't worried about the police bothering them. Even when I came on as an advocate, it was post-Shirling, and all of the reports of quote-unquote police cutting up my tent were unsubstantiated. You could not say that it was the police. And that kind of impressed me for a long time. I was feeling like maybe there had been a change. In any event, the fact that I've had a professional relationship with Lacey Smith for these many years, and I have a very, very deep respect for her. But in our recent experience, that respect has deteriorated a little bit, or I have to say, maybe she's under pressure that she can't resist, and she can't be the person that I know her to be. But in any event, the people in the homeless community always feel unsafe with police when they show up at Sears Lane. Just a couple of days ago, and I would like to address this to Mr. Murad, and Joan, because you're both saying that there's a shortage of police power. But 2 days ago, 8 cruisers and a phalanx of police officers showed up, parked in a line. WCAX came, filmed them, must have been talking to them. We don't know what they were saying. And then as soon as the cameras left, the police left. So you have to wonder, I would like you to put yourselves in the position of people who are homeless in the camp when they see this huge phalanx of police cars show up, and you think, what, are they here to bust us? Are they going to come in with the clubs and get rid of us? Or are we just going to watch, wait, and let them disappear? Well, first of all, is that really a good use of police resources when you're complaining that you don't have enough cops to do the job as it is? That's the first thing. So the other question that came up was about the police officers feeling unsupported. And I'm not sure I'm sympathetic to that issue because I'm not sure that all police officers are police officers we want. If they're feeling unsupported, maybe it's because we have a community, a progressive community, that doesn't want police violence. I can't say that as a fact. I don't know. That's the suspicion that comes up in my mind, that there might be a reason. But my biggest complaint is that when the police officers show up at Sears Lane, they don't come in and say hello. Now, liaisons, Lacey does, Lacey will, Anthony does. But the police officers, they don't come in and say hello. They walk in, and I confronted an officer one time, and she said, "This is public property. We get to be here and do whatever we want." Well, I'm sorry, this is our home. We don't want police officers just barging in and acting like we don't. It's like not our living. It's our living room. To be treated like that is so degrading. You could be a human being and walk over to somebody and say, "Hi, I'm Officer Blank. How are you today? I'd like to do an investigation. Do you mind if I poke around a little bit?" There could be so much more respect. Okay, that's the beginning of it. I'd like to invite Julie to make a comment for a minute, and Gray to take a minute to make a comment.
Hi, I'm Julie Masuga. I won't take up too much of your time. I just wanted to speak. I was potentially going to be on this panel and things got complicated. Just bringing a perspective of police abolition and mutual aid to the discussion. What I wanted to stress is that houseless residents are constituents. They are neighbors. They are part of the ward. They are not some outside force. They are people. The city initially promised the people of Sears Lane electricity, water, coordinated management of the site, and instead the mayor gave residents 5 days to leave initially, arguing that things were unsafe because of one person's action. I've spent a lot of time down there as a young queer woman alone at Sears Lane and have taken refuge in the camp several times. I never felt unsafe. I felt extremely unsafe when Officer Joseph Coro barged into my home after responding to a call for an ambulance for someone in mental health distress. Coro, who should have been removed from the force. And I also just want to point out that Police Chief Murad continues to have sole authority over the investigation and discipline of police officers in Burlington, so our community has no way to hold violent officers accountable. And these are the same police officers that show up to places like Sears Lane, often without giving explanation, as Stephen said. And I can't imagine something more terrifying or more dangerous, if we're talking about safety, something more dangerous than forcing people to leave their homes in the middle of winter in a pandemic and giving them, okay, you've got 30 days in a hotel that we had to beg for the city to give them.
And the city doesn't offer to everybody else who is houseless in the city. It's just because they want these houseless people to leave where they are so that they can clear out the camp.
So just, these are people, these are our friends, and I'm scared for them.
Gray, would you like to add something?
Thank you, Julie. Actually, kind of to go off Julie, what Julie said, what are you telling the city of Burlington, the people of the city of Burlington who are potentially losing their homes? What are you trying to say to their position as a human if they lose their house and they end up living on the street? The distinction that seems to be happening with what an unhoused person is I think maybe considering that message to what unhoused equals and how that perspective is taken. Regarding bikes, I just wanted to have a quick note that Julie of Betty's Bikes has been going down to Sears Lane for years, getting bike parts, picking up frames, and has, in the years that she's gone there, and she was ready to testify in court about this, she hasn't encountered a single stolen bike, and this is years of collecting bikes on a regular basis. So Chief, when I spoke to you down at at Sears Lane, you said, well, there's all these stolen bikes here. I didn't see an officer picking up any bikes. I didn't see anyone even looking at these. There was a broad statement that every bike there is a stolen bike, was kind of indicative of the perspective of unhoused equals criminal, and there's nothing but criminal activity there. So, yeah.
That's a misrepresentation of our discussion. May I rebut it, or is
Well,
that
sure.
not part of this?
I want to be careful to not get in too much of a back and forth. I certainly do want to give you an opportunity to respond. First of all, Gray and Julie and Stephen, I appreciate your being here and your points of view, so thank you very much for contributing. Chief Murad, I do want to give you an opportunity to respond, but I also want to sort of move the discussion in, and Stephen mentioned sort of an acknowledgement in response to something Councilor Shannon mentioned about sort of failure of our systems in providing other resources. So in addition to responding, I guess, from your perspective, if you could speak to, and you mentioned it in your first comments as well, about CSOs and CSL, sort of what efforts, not just within the police department, I know that may be what you're able to speak to, but to the other panelists as well, right? What are the resources that are available, the alternative resources, or what's in the cards to address some of the issues that we've talked about thus far?
Sure. So that's probably a more productive avenue than rebutting inaccuracies. But I think that there is an opportunity in front of us to see a different way of dealing with these kinds of situations. And we have not we have not had a single citation issued at the encampment since the trespass notices were issued. Enforcement is not the avenue that we have chosen to explore. We're using the community support liaisons and working with CVOEO in order to find alternatives for the people there. The fact of the matter is that code enforcement, the fire department, and the police department went through the site and found it to be utterly parlous. It is not a safe location, period. There are structures there that are not up to code. There are multiple generators running. There was a situation that was ultimately going to lead in everyone who has a professional expertise in this subject to potentially a death. And the fire chief characterized that as a likely outcome should winter descend. We've seen that before in encampments in Burlington. We've seen violence in encampments. We've seen deaths in encampments. No one wants a repeat of that. But we also don't want the sense of people being moved out in a way that does not make them safer. And we also don't want enforcement in a way that is either appears to be unfair or is unnecessary when there are other alternatives available. That's why we're building these. So the CSL alternative is one of being able to work with folks, to be able to talk with them. I'm sorry to hear that you think your relationship with Lacey has deteriorated. I think incredibly highly of her. She is one of the best employees that this city has. And that's why I created the community support liaison position, to basically clone Lacey. I'd been saying it for quite some time that that's what I wanted to do. Those positions are able to do that. Now, there are some things that we need to do next, and that brings us to, I think, what Councilor Shannon was talking about, which is, frankly, we do not have a custodial mental health care capacity. When we have individuals who, say, have mental health conditions that cause them to terrorize landlords or to become problems to the community, and we don't have a way of addressing that through the courts because they're ruled to be incompetent by the courts, or because they are, in one way or another, not able to be held accountable by our criminal judicial system, we do need to have some kind of custodial capacity so that people can get care that they need and can be put in a position not to be threatening their neighbors, not to be harassing or stalking people, or causing problems for themselves or others that are endangering themselves or others. We want to avoid that. That's a rarity, but we don't have any real capacity for it, and we need some. So those are things that I think we need to work on next, because some of the things that I think that Commissioner Saguino is going to talk about in this mental health care summit are about addressing the street level behavior in order to interrupt it, stop it, see if we can find alternatives. But the next step for many of these individuals is, what do we do with them in a way to help them next? And right now, allowing that encampment to maintain and perpetuate was not a helpful situation. The mayor attempted to find a solution for it, was unable to do that, We had a lot of people who came in after the fact suddenly volunteering, but that was not present when these decisions were made. And we've had significant criminality out of there. Stolen property, drug use, drug sales. A lot of cars have been recovered there. It is a known location for other municipalities to come when a car is missing, and they have recovered stolen cars from the site. So these are issues that we really have to deal with.
Thank you, Chief. I was going to ask Professor Saguino, and then happy to turn to you, Joan, just because it's been mentioned that the mental health summit that the police commission is putting together, and I'm wondering if we could just sort of go to that and ask you what's coming up. Are you able to publicize any information about it to this group here, and sort of what was the impetus behind the commission putting this together?
Well, the impetus really was the data that we've seen on mental health issues, and we have commissioners who are social workers and have a lot of expertise in this area. I will say that we passed the resolution to hopefully urge the mayor and the city council to mount this. We don't have the capacity as the commission to do that, but we are able to see with the reports that we get from the police, with our conversations with distressed people, that, and just my own background as an economist, what Joan was mentioning is that we've severely defunded social services. We have extraordinary inequality in this country, and we have the effects of the COVID crisis that have worsened people's economic status, and we have declining life expectancy because of drug overdoses. So we have a structural problem in the United States as a whole, and we have to deal with it here at the local level. And it means that I think that the city council and mayor can be the conveners of the parties that can actually help us develop a system of care rather than putting it on the shoulders of the police department, which doesn't have the capacity and does not have the training by their own acknowledgement. So that's the idea. And I personally am a optimistic and can-do person. Chip is right. You know, there are some things we can't do, but we can do better than we have done. And I keep seeing this can kick down the road. And my goal as a commissioner, and I think us as a commission, is to highlight these issues, and to the extent we can, to publicize them and to get the parties that can do something to do something about it. One of the things I will say is that and perhaps the city councilors can say something about this. My understanding is that there was an RFP, or is an RFP, going out for social service agencies to develop a cahoots type of model that Eugene, Oregon has, in which there is far less reliance on the police and rather social workers responding to many different kinds of events that occur. That is important. It doesn't substitute for the fact that we don't have a complete system of care, a continuum of care in this city, and that has to be dealt with. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that's great. Councilor Shannon, happy to hear the comment that you had, but also would like to turn to you and Councilor Mason in the context of what can the city do? Obviously, the city doesn't have infinite resources. No doubt the state and other partners play a role in this as well. But what is the council looking at, the city looking at, to provide additional resources to fill in the gap that you were referencing before, how we've defunded some of these resources? And I guess a follow-up to that, I mean, I know a lot of municipalities, Burlington included, have federal monies coming in through ARPA. Is that a part of this as well?
Well, first, I just want to say I have personally recovered 3 stolen bicycles at Sears Lane and been contacted by another person who recovered their bicycle at Sears Lane. So I don't think the picture being painted is accurate of what is happening there. At the same time, I want to recognize that within the community at Sears Lane, there's actually a lot of talent and hardworking people. People who had to work very hard to construct what they have constructed at Sears Lane, and who have skills to contribute to our community. And I hope that that is something that we're able to lift up, you know, the good that everybody has within them, and the skills that people have to contribute to the community. With regards to Cahoots, I also want to clarify that Cahoots was not a program that defunded the police to give resources to mental health and other things. It was a program completely supported by the police, recognizing, as our police have for a very long time, that police are increasingly being asked to provide social services that they're ill-equipped to provide. And so those resources were added to the police resources with full support of the police and working together to address community needs. And I know that the chief can speak far better than I can to, what's developing here in Burlington. But also, I want to say that it was not the city of Burlington that defunded any of these resources. These were resources provided by the state and the federal government. And if you think about, I think Chief Murad, I'm sorry, not Chief Murad, Chief Sherling, going all the way back to Chief Sherling, he came to this NPA and he asked us in 1970, how many beds did we have for mental health care? And I don't know, people threw out all kinds of numbers. I think the number, if I remember it correctly, was like 2,000 beds.
Wow.
And he said, how many beds do you think we have today for mental health care? Nobody guessed. 40. 40 was the number of beds we had at that time. We've lost beds since that time. And I also don't think that it's accurate to say that we're talking about always custodial care, as you referenced, Chief. People who are seeking health care, mental health care, which is health care, voluntarily in this community cannot access it. When you go into the hospital, and I have been there, when you go into the hospital and you say, I am at risk of hurting myself or others, you may be there. You go in there voluntarily, and you may be there for weeks in the emergency room because there's no bed for you. And you know you need help. And at some point, you're probably going to say, I am not a risk to myself or others because I need to get out of here because I had anxiety when I came in. And after only a few hours, that anxiety is much, much higher. So that's the defunding of other resources has not happened by the city. And I don't think that the city, we're funded by property tax dollars, which is not a great way to fund anything. And so the idea that the city can pick up these pieces, I don't think is realistic. I do think as the police commission is helping to facilitate this conversation, and I think that we can do that. But we can't fund mental health care statewide on property taxpayer dollars, which is how the city gets money. So maybe the chief could talk more about the cahoots or.
Let me just sort of fill in some of the details on the questions. Yes, we did pass the mental health summit. I don't have a specific date, but that will be happening. The RFP for cahoots is going forward. ARPA funds are a Band-Aid. It's not a long-term solution. ARPA funds are being used to deal with some of the issues at Sears Lane, but I'll be honest, every week we get another resolution where ARPA funds are being thrown around. And that is not a long-term solution to the issues that are going. In terms of other resources, Ben, you asked a question. I will say something that I've seen that a positive that has come out of the Sears Lane crisis is a level of attention at the state level that I think we have not seen just based on emails that I've been copying on. Without putting anyone in the room on the spot, I know our state reps have really come together to sort of start a conversation, working groups. I've seen secretary level people commented. I don't know the status of those conversations, but I will admit it's at least at a level of a conversation that I've never been copied on, beyond just city councilors and administration. So I don't know what will come of that, but I am encouraged at least that conversation appears to have been started.
Great. I saw that we had some Q&A there on the screen, Joe. I don't know, have you been monitoring those? Is there a question from there? Or I do want to, we have about an hour or 45 minutes left here. If there's folks in the room who have a question, yes, over there. Yeah, yes.
I have a process question for the. Come up to the mic just so that the recording can pick you up.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry.
That recording is just.
It's for the Zoom.
It's not for the room,
Oh.
it's for the.
Hello, Zoom. Okay, I had a question for the council members in the room, just process-wise. I'm curious when you're thinking about who your constituents are when you're making your canvassing maps or your phone banking lists, or thinking about the demographics in your constituency, or what your constituents want in terms of policies, do you calculate the unhoused community members who live within your ward in those calculations?
Either of you have.
I consider everybody on the voter list.
I would agree. I mean, the population, I mean, as we all know, it's ebbed and flowed over the course of the last 4 years. I stood for election 2 years ago. I couldn't tell you. The population was a fraction of what it was prior to recent action.
Are there any, Joe, I don't know if there's any questions from the Q&A that would be appropriate at this point in time. Happy for you to take a look at that. I can't see them up on the screen, so.
Yeah, there was just a couple of mentions of things that came up in the room already, so I'm just kind of struggling to see anything that's brand new here.
Well, feel free to raise it. Again, we have about 45 minutes and do want to make sure that if any folks here have questions. Yeah, Sam.
So I was happy to hear you bring to light this potential conflation of the Sears Lane encampment with public safety, which is something that I've heard a lot on Front Porch Forum, of the vandalism that Chip was referencing. And I guess it's good that you brought it up, because it does sound like some people are conflating those two things. And I guess I just want to say I don't necessarily believe that. And I want folks to understand that that's not a shared opinion amongst the group. So I think that we all have to understand that vandalism could be happening from outside forces. It doesn't necessarily mean that because there's a homeless encampment down the block that everybody is doing these bad things. So that's just my point of view. I don't have a question, but I just wanted to make it clear that not everyone feels that there's a conflation there.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate that point of view. Yeah, right here.
I guess along those lines, hi, I'm Alex. I also live just down the street here. There seems to also be kind of a potential conflation of the fact that we have less police officers and now more, I guess, Category 1 crimes or something like that. And it sounds like the problem's a bit more complicated than that. It's not just that we have less police officers, so now everyone's going out in the street and committing crimes. It sounds like there's larger systemic things happening. There's more people in difficult situations right now. And so, yeah, I just also wanted to speak to that point as well. Like, we can't necessarily assume that. I think it's a interesting thing to look at and maybe gather more data around, but I don't know that we can just assume the relationship between those two things is causal.
Yeah, it's, thank you both for those points. And Chief, I guess I would follow up with you on this point. Yeah. Stephen, yeah, please, if you have a comment, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to say to Joan, I'm really glad you got your bikes back. I've lived in downtown and I had 3 bikes stolen and I didn't know where to go to get them. So you're really lucky. You
They're
knew
not
where to
my
go.
bikes.
You're lucky you knew where to go. There's no denial that there is crime, but as Alex just said, we cannot automatically attribute it to a particular homeless encampment. The fact that there were 25 people living there might have brought a focus point. I mean, the fact that Joan knew where to go to get her bikes made it easier to attribute the crime to the Sears Lane camp. But that doesn't mean that it's more concentrated than if you took those 25 people and put them in the community in other places. It just makes it easier to say, well, this camp is the problem. Well, the camp is not the problem. It's the lack of structure. 4 years ago, I told the mayor, you have to regulate this. You need to have a plan. This is a perfect place for homeless folks, and if you regulate this, if you set it up with a management plan, people will be able to come here, live here peacefully and within the law. The problem with the Sears Lane camp is that it's outside the law. The law does not acknowledge it. It does not exist as a place where people are sanctioned to go. if there was a management plan, if there had been, it never would have grown in the cancerous way that it did. It would not have exploded with trash and crime. It's completely the failure of the vision of the administration of the city of Burlington to recognize their opportunity to do the right thing and create Sears Lane as a place for homeless folks to go. He said, I don't want to promote homelessness in the camp. Well, sorry, bud. It's kind of like saying I don't want to promote drugs by handing out needles. Drugs promote themselves. You don't have to hand out needles to promote drugs. And if you're going to have a perfect place for homeless folks to go, they're going to go there, and it's not going to matter whether you promote it or not. So you might as well step forward and give it a structure. Okay, here's an area for you, here's an area for you, and by the way, we'll give you some water, and we'll give you porta-johns, and we'll try to set up a shower so that you can stay clean, and we'll bring in social services people, and we'll create an environment for a self-regulated community to actually thrive. But that wasn't done. That could have been done. But what you need to know is that since people were allowed to move in there and do whatever it is that they wanted without being within the law, naturally you're going to get something that is offensive to the law. That's how it works. So take responsibility, step up to the plate, and work with us to create a viable, meaningful, self-regulated community.
Thanks, Stephen. I do want to.
Behind you, raising
John?
Hi, Murad. Good, how are you? Good. Thank you for your comments. I've felt the same way. And I didn't think that we would be in agreement, but that's been my observation, is that the Sears Lane encampment there's no housing that's permitted in this part of the city, whether it's market rate housing or housing for the homeless. I don't know how it's been allowed to continue, but it's on public property and it's unsupervised, and you're right, it's outside of the law. And there's been a lot of lawlessness that's been exhibited there. And unfortunately, that has dominated and become the primary characteristic of that. And that's the reason why any of the social service agencies, I think, that were approached with an RFP to manage it, it was too late. I think they saw a high risk assessment and a low probability of success because the population that was there, really didn't want to be managed.
Oh, that's not true.
Well, that's what you were just saying. It's just like, I'm not too sure if it's public property. We all should be welcomed by your own logic.
We've actually.
Excuse me. And if this is going to be, I also agree with your statement that the city council abdicated its responsibility. But what's done is done. If moving forward, if there's going to be any sort of homeless encampment on public property, it has to be a managed one, so that the unsocial and antisocial behaviors that was exhibited by some of the campers on Sears Lane is not allowed to happen at all. But I think that, does the community have, I think, a moral obligation to respond to homelessness in the community? Yes, I believe that. But I just condemn what has gone on at Sears Lane and been allowed to continue at Sears Lane. And I'm thankful that it's no longer there.
Somebody on the screen asked for you to identify yourself.
I'm sorry?
Someone asked for you to identify yourself.
Hi, I'm John Collow. I live in the adjoining Lakeside neighborhood.
So thanks, John. And I think to that point, of course, we're still, now that we're in these hybrid formats, we're getting used to sort of hybrid etiquette. And so for folks up on the screen, if folks in the room are talking, if we could identify ourselves beforehand, just so they know who's chatting. I want to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to Stephen's comments if they'd like, and then we'll take questions or comments we will go to other folks who haven't had an opportunity to speak yet first, but I do want to give.
Can I clarify one point? I would be very brief.
Sure.
It is not factually true that nobody wanted to manage Sears Lane Camp step forward. It's that the plan that was offered by CVOEO wasn't found to be the plan the city wanted, because CVOEO wanted to work with the campers to actually manage their community together with CVOEO. The city turned that plan down because the city wanted control over the camp and wanted to evict the people in the camp. Well, that is our surmise, but what is true is the city turned down the offer.
Stephen, I'm sorry, but I wish you would not put forth facts that you don't know as fact. I mean, that is completely inconsistent with the facts as they've been presented to me. And it really, unfortunately, casts us in a litigious manner.
That's great. I want to hear what you have to say, Chip. I just wish that the city had stepped forward and talked to us instead of us having to learn about it in the news. Tell us what you know.
Stephen, I am not, first of all, I'm not the administration. I'm not going to stand here and defend, nor am I in possession of all the facts.
Good.
But what you just described is completely inconsistent with the facts as presented to us.
Okay.
And you qualified that by saying, I don't know it to be true. So my only request is if you don't know it to be true, please don't said something out that you know is going to be inflammatory. Looking forward, which is where I would like to look, the model you're envisioning is something that is under very serious discussion. I don't believe the administration nor the council are prepared to come forward with it, but what you've just described in terms of a managed encampment is, I think there is agreement on that, and that is at least under discussion. Whether it comes to fruition, I'm not in that loop to say, yes, it's going to happen by a certain date or not. But I think we are in agreement in terms of that. I respectfully disagree in terms of what went on at the site and efforts that were made by the administration in order to not have to shut it down. And another point to make clear, although there was a resolution that was hotly debated before the full city council, just for the benefit of those listening, the way our policy is structured, the decision is the mayor's and the mayor's alone. So some of what you saw at the council was a little bit performative because at the end of the day, what we said didn't matter other than potentially influencing the mayor in his decision.
If I could just follow up on just one question with the chief, to follow up on the points made by Sam and by Alex. We've talked some about sort of uptick in front porch forum posts and community discussion. I know that in the Addition neighborhood, for example, there's been a number of posts recently about tire slashings and the like and other property crimes. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm right, Chief, that the department's identified perhaps one individual who was largely responsible for a number, or at least allegedly responsible for a number of those reports that were made on Front Porch Forum. And to the point raised by some of the folks here, we've had vandalism like that in the neighborhood that's caused a lot of discussion on Front Porch Forum. I'm thinking about the BB gun incident where windows were being shot out from a few years ago, of course, before we were even discussing issues related to defunding or the police cap or what have you. So I suppose, again, continuing the discussion on root causes, I'm wondering if you can speak to and respond to some of those points that were made of not only this issue of sort of conflating the Sears Lane community with crime in the neighborhood, but also the question of conflating the decrease in staff on the police force with crime issues, and just hoping you could address that point that was made by a couple folks.
Sure. So there are a couple of things there. With regard to Sears Lane specifically, I don't necessarily think that the crime emanates out from it. My concern is the crime that we know occurs within it and the recovery of stolen property within it. Many of the things that you actually sort of, I think, stipulated to, Stephen. You talked about the situation there with regard to finding items, with regard to the idea that because there's no management, that's what's allowed crime to fester. But there is crime there, period. And a significant amount of it. So that's one issue. I think that I hear what you said about the fact that we don't believe those vandalisms are actually associated with the encampment. We did arrest an individual who was committing those kinds of vandalisms. He's the same individual who smashed a car near City Hall and also then smashed City Hall, broke through the windows of Contois Auditorium. an individual who is a good example of what I think is a person who needs custodial mental health care. It's not appropriate for jail, but also is not appropriate for being out in the community because of his behavior and conditions. We're not 100% sure that that is the person who is responsible for all of those vandalisms. The MO is a little different. His MO was really one of great brazenness and daylight, and the others were committed at night. So I'm not 100% sure that's our person. We haven't seen any. With regard to what you talked about with the previous examples of vandalism, the way in which we were able to handle that was about a staffing issue. It was the fact that we had a far more robust staffing availability. We put a street crime team on that case. They spent a lot of time doing patrols. They also did a lot of work on trying to get people to understand that they wanted tips. And what they ended up getting was a tip from somebody who said, we know who these guys are. They watch WWE on Monday nights, and then they go out and shoot cars. And so they then patrolled on Monday nights and were able to apprehend those two gentlemen who were committing those acts of vandalism. That is a resource issue, and it's one that we don't currently have. I've talked about how I would handle this South End issue before we made that apprehension, and we don't have the same number of people that we can dedicate to that issue, and that is a component. But I think all of that comes back to sort of, I don't think that the neighborhood itself was causing great amounts of crime elsewhere necessarily, although certainly neighbors feel it. Neighbors feel a certain amount of pressure, and they are definitely affected by the quality of life issues that come out of that place with regard to noise, with regard to activity. And those are important as well, they are as important as crime.
And so one other question I'd then like to follow up on, and happy to turn back to the room. And Tammy, perhaps I would turn to you on this as well. I apologize for not coming to you in some time there. But to answer a question that was raised earlier by the gentleman here, as well as by Stephen to a certain extent, which is the relationship that different communities and folks have with police. This gentleman raised the fact of calling up 911 and feeling that he was treated in a particular way. Stephen, in a very different capacity, speaks to the relationship with a member of your force and feeling like that relationship has changed. I suspect that, regardless of how you feel about the cap or defund or whatever you want to call it, that members in your force are feeling overworked and understaffed. And I suppose the question I have for you, given that we're some time away from addressing, even from your perspective, I would think that some of your recruitment and retention challenges, what is the department doing now to train its staff and to work in building and repairing relationships, not only with folks who are using your services and having to call up 911, but also folks like Stephen or obviously many different communities that are out there. So happy to turn to you, and then Tammy would be interested to hear from your perspective, because you all are really, the face of the city and the face of the services in these contexts, and so would be interested to hear that.
So the short answer, and I'll try to keep it at a short answer because I want others to speak, is that is an incredibly big challenge right now. Officers are overworked. They are working more overtime hours than they ever have. They're not picking up overtime details. The Halloween bike ride, for example, which was a great overtime detail, did not get an officer escort. I had to come in on Sunday, and I drove the cruiser to do the officer escort for it because no one would sign up for it. And the reason they won't sign up is because they're being routinely held on regular shifts, either over or being asked to come in early in order to paper over gaps that we have in service. And is that affecting customer service? I believe that it is, and I don't like hearing, sir, the way in which you feel treated by dispatch. I've heard it. I know that it is an issue. We are working on that. Our dispatch is short as well, not because of defunding, but it's been an ongoing issue. And how you get officers to remain engaged in a really positive way beyond mere sort of utilitarian functions of saying I do this way and I'm not being rude and I'm not actually mistreating people, but this is how I'm going through my day, as opposed to the kind of customer service that you're envisioning with regard to coming in and greeting. That's certainly how I do it, but I'm also not out on the road every day. I spend most of my time doing other kinds of things, and so when I do get on the road, it's easier for me to be a little bit more friendly and happy in that way. I wish that I could get all of the officers to behave in that way. Certainly when there are overt deficiencies, we address them, and I hold people accountable for those. But the kinds that we're talking about are challenges for me, and I don't have a great answer about what to do yet. But it is something that occupies me a lot, and I'm working on.
Tammy, are you able to speak to that from your perspective with street outreach?
So can you just clarify a little bit more about the question? I mean, we heard, I can't speak to how the police department is feeling in terms of burnout or support. I can speak to, I think one of the things that I keep hearing here is that, or I keep reading in the chat, is that, regardless of anything that anyone in this room tries to do, or even any people who are seeking social services might try to do, there are not a lot of options for people who need acute inpatient. And I kind of feel like a lot of the things that we are seeing that, people want to say, well, that's because they're criminal, well, that's because they're homeless, well, that's because they're mentally ill, well, that's because they have substance abuse issues. I mean, I think it's, in my perspective, it's because there are no options for people to get treatment to transition to a different space in their life. I mean, this week has been, for my team, kind of frustrating because we've had people who are crying and begging to get into inpatient treatment. We've had, the people that are the sort of gate holders of those facilities, wanting to get them into it, and then they're either not being space, or there's an insurance issue, or that simply isn't offered in this state. So just a real lack of mobility, whether it be for people who need to move forward where they are in terms of their mental health or their substance use, or for unhoused people to move forward to housing. And I'm just about to lose service here. My battery's going to die. But there is nowhere for people to move forward to. And that just ends up being a lack of hope. So there's, on the one hand, no consequences that might disincentivize people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. But there's, more importantly, not really a lot of anything to motivate people to move forward. And I think what the city did in Sears Lane is nice. I think the efforts that they've made to help people move along and the variety of things that were offered. But in the end, none of them are going to be solutions that are going to be useful to that person in the next 2 years. And those people will be right back to where they were, today. So that's what we are seeing, is just a lack of real mobility for people that people are very aware of, and it's wearing on them heavily.
Thanks, Tammy. We have an interesting question here online from Amanda, but yes, down here.
I'd like to change gears if I may.
Yep.
City Council and the Developmental Review Board authorized the largest indoor concert arena on the south end for 1,500 people. There's only 2 ways to get into that venue. One is down Queen City Parkway with a 1-lane bridge. Does that put our city at risk? The other is going down Home Avenue. According to Vermont Digger, the last year that Higher Ground was in operation in South Burlington, they had 137 police calls in 1 year. Now, they're increasing the capacity by 33%, so we'll probably see more police calls. Let's say, call it 3 calls per week. How is our police department going to be able to do that when I just hear you talk about you can't even get officers to do the Halloween bike ride, and I live on South Crest Drive, and it's right next to my neighborhood?
And if I could just, before turning it back to them, it's a great question. I think it aligns with a number of questions that we received before tonight as well, so if you wouldn't
I can't
mind-
hear you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it aligns with a number of questions we received before, which is to sort of use the chief's terminology here, right? A lot of items that are sort of lower priority, at least on the priority 1, 2, 3 scale from the police department's perspective, are a very high priority to some neighbors in their day-to-day life, right? So we received a lot of questions before this about traffic, not only with respect to, potential concert venue down the line, but in the here and now as well.
And 137 calls in 1 year.
Yeah, and
Our police department.
right. So we received a number of questions about sort of speeding traffic, particularly at nighttime. Tweaked mufflers and the like. Folks seeing some sort of uptick there, and I know. We don't have all the folks here in the room. DPW has a lot to say about traffic as well and so on. But I guess, we have a question here from Amanda as well online, which is, well, okay, if there are fewer police to patrol, and I don't know that community service officers and CSLs are going to be the folks to address some of these issues related to traffic and so on. So what are the solutions to neighbors with respect to issues like those raised here and those raised by some other folks who asked some questions here?
Is that a
Yeah, I think you're probably in the best position to mention it.
Okay, thanks for that question. I wish John were still here. John actually, I had long meetings with John and with others involved in the Burton project and with Sean Burke in South Burlington. I grew up in Underhill. My dad taught at UVM. My parents both taught at UVM. My dad was there for about 35 years. I remember when Higher Ground was still Merrill's. They had a very good relationship with South Burlington PD with regard to the way in which they maintain their own security there. The relationship, the promises that were made to me with regard to the department signing off on the various permits and things was that they envision having that same relationship. They're actually going to really make it more robust with regard to their security posture and their traffic control posture. It is, I think, going to be a challenge. I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to figure out how we split our attention between downtown but they also end earlier. So one of the good things is that facility will be, yes, it is, their plan is 11:30 close versus a 2 o'clock downtown bar close. And as a result, we are able to have resources in this area before bringing them back to Church and Main. Usually we put resources at Church and Main around 12:30, 1 o'clock in order to be there for bar closing. So that's one answer. And then I think the other is about quality of life issues, right? So I got my master's degree at the Kennedy School, and when I was at the Kennedy School working with an executive team there, we were talking about quality of life issues. Traffic was one. The fact of the matter is that the best methods for addressing traffic are not enforcement-based. They are a wider range of options that come largely from engineering. We have, as I mentioned earlier in the evening, really reduced our traffic stops by well over 80% at this point. And the rationale for that is that we saw real disparities in those traffic stops, real racial disparities. We've eliminated those disparities when we account for driving population as measured by crash data. And we are I'm very proud of that. I want to continue that. Now, are we seeing crashes uptick? We are seeing crashes increase a little bit. But I think what we're describing here, again, it comes back to sort of what the counselor was saying. We're back in line with previous years, much higher than 2020, but 2020 had very few traffic deaths in Burlington, in cities. You saw huge deaths on the highways because the highways were open season. There's a real cannonball run, like that silly movie with Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise, and they do it, and last March, at the beginning of the pandemic, they reset the record 4 times in March and April of 2020 because there was no one on the roads. And so they set, people who spent a lot of time souping up their cars went out and on the highways. Highway deaths rose. City deaths did not. Our crash data dropped a lot in 2020. It's picked up again this year, but only to normal levels. So what we're not seeing is a commensurate increase in traffic crash that is related to our drastic decrease in stops. And as a result, I'm not in a place to ask officers to increase their traffic enforcement. I think that what we need, however, is a sense of where neighborhoods feel they're getting response with regard to stop signs, with regard to other things like that. And that's a good question. It's a big question. And those are not things that our CSOs or CSLs would do in addressing those kinds of calls. There's other kinds of quality of life that they would. So, and I'll leave it at that. I don't want to be the only one talking.
And we're looking at 250 to 750 cars per night going down 2 roads, and one of the roads is a 1-lane bridge. Would the city, would the city and me as a taxpayer be at risk if someone gets hurt on a 1-lane road, 1-lane bridge?
I do want to come back and see if any of the other panelists have ideas sort of as to solutions here. Andy, I see you had a question. Sir, I know you had a question before. I don't know if you still have it or not, but okay, Andy.
Did you? I guess I want to step back a little bit from we're talking a lot about, like, you know, whether the police will be able to do this, whether the social services will be able to do that. Thank you. You know, I feel like the whole society, and Burlington is no exception, is under a lot of stress, and is going to continue to be under a lot of stress for a variety of things. The pandemic is one, climate change is another, the sort of coarseness of the political discourse overall is another, and how that impacts how we talk to each other. And I think that kind of disintegration and that kind of fraying is going to continue. But I think that really I want to think about together, not just tonight, but other times, how we address issues of public safety as a community, other than relying on street outreach, the police, how we address that. I mean, I think in the South End in particular, we have very strong neighborhoods. We have very strong communities. My visits to Sears Lane have shown me that that's a very strong community. And whenever I've been there, it's an example of people helping each other. Stephen was talking about mutual aid. It's an example of people depending on each other, and for lots of material problems, but also like emotional support. And I think that within our neighborhoods and within our community, we have to depend on that as a way of buttressing not only our sense of well-being, but our sense of safety. And I'm not advocating, you know, vigilante justice within Burlington. I am saying that mutual aid, mutual support, community work together is going to be the basis of any kind of real public safety. And whether we have 88 police officers or 73 police officers or more CSOs and more people like Lacey and Tammy out there, you know, that's what we need to depend on.
Yeah, and I think, just to follow up on that, Andy, and then happy to turn to the panelists and happy to come to you, sir, is to sort of reframe, and this is a question that was asked online as well, and you touched on it, right, which is that there's some concern among folks here in the chat about sort of vigilante justice, you know, setting up folks feeling they would need to set up, you know, neighborhood watch programs or what have you, and feeling leery of that as an answer. And so I guess I'm curious to hear from our panelists, just from a solutions-based discussion, you know, what other than that, to the extent neighbors are looking for a way to address some of these issues that they see in their neighborhoods, you know, what are the answers in the here and now? We've touched on some of it, but I'm just curious to hear if any of you have any additional feedback. Do you have a comment on it, or?
Yes, mutual respect. Okay, I've lived next to this encampment longer and closer than anybody in this city. I get woken up at 11, 12, 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, okay? I work during the day, but I gotta listen to that motorcycle revving its engine any hour of the day or night, okay? I gotta listen to fireworks. I gotta listen to thumping music. I gotta listen to all this stuff when I gotta sleep, because I gotta go to work in the morning, okay? Mutual respect is, you respect your neighbors, okay? I've lived next to this for 10 years, okay? Not once have I ever gone over there to harass them. But I got to deal with this day in and day out, 7 days a week, 365 days and nights a year. Okay? That's what I see every day. So when you talk about we have strong communities, and they're a strong community, but they don't respect their neighbors. Okay? And without respect for your neighbors, you're not going to get respect back. So you have to have some mutual respect for everyone. That's the way it goes. Without that, you got nothing.
Yeah, well, and in the interest of not just making this about Sears Lane, I think that there's folks throughout the neighborhood who would also argue that even folks who live well away from the Sears Lane community, that they as well are dealing with revving motorcycles and revving engines and loud mufflers and fireworks and thumping music as folks pull up to stop signs in some of the main thoroughfares. And I think the question that folks are seeking answers to is what, when you're in this situation, or if you're living at the corner of another main thoroughfare and that's what you're dealing with, and you're sensing some uptick in this, and I'll certainly come back to you, Stephen, on this as well. But what are the solutions to that? And I know that one of the answers that some folks may say is, well, more police officers to patrol and so on. But cold comfort, perhaps, given recruitment retention issues at this point in time, and how far off we may be from that being the answer, assuming that is the answer, right? I know there's folks who have different viewpoints on that. So do any of our panelists here have any thoughts on sort of what are the solutions in the here and now for folks who are feeling some of the stresses that Andy's talked about? Joan?
Well, I want to acknowledge that have been in place just within our families. Our families haven't been able to get together to take care of each other the way we once did. And that there are a lot of people in our community who are less fortunate and maybe never had a family that could help them. And I know that when my grandmother came here as an immigrant, she came into an immigrant community where there was a sense of belonging, because ethnic groups tended to come into the same community, and there was a sense of brethren and family because of that. And so as a immigrant and a single mother of 3 children, she would still take somebody in from the street. She would have boundaries. You could not come if you were not sober. If he had been drinking, and this wasn't randomly, this was a person that she had created a relationship with, that she trusted, but at the same time knew that that he couldn't be trusted if he was drinking. She had her girls to worry about, and so while creating boundaries, she still was willing to take somebody into her home, having lived on the other side of extreme poverty, of having nothing, of not having enough food to eat, and being able to relate to that. And one of the things that we've become more reliant on a government social safety net, and I think we sometimes abdicate that responsibility as individuals because we rely on the government social safety net. I believe the government should provide a social safety net, but I also think that what the mutual aid systems do is bring that personal accountability back as well. So that is a good thing. But there's always 2 sides to every coin, and the side of that I think is concerning to the support side is really wonderful. But when you run into problems and you start dealing with the problems without bringing in the police, that's when we're going over to vigilantism. And so that's where I think that there's a feeling both on the left and the right of taking matters into our own hands in terms of protecting ourselves And that's why I value a professionally trained police force. It may be flawed, but it's better than vigilantism. And I don't have the answer. I guess I just want to raise awareness that there are things we can do as individuals. We need to get back to I'm really glad everybody came in the room tonight, or a lot of people came in this room tonight. And I think we all need that. It's part of humanizing one another. And maybe we can all work towards that, but I don't know a more perfect system. I think that we are really trying to, we're acknowledging and we're speaking to the facts that we need other resources other than police resources. We're working on it. But we have such a long way to go to building that system that has completely broken down, as Brian Chena put in the chat. This started breaking down in 1963. So it's not going to be rebuilt in a day or a year, or probably two, or, it's a long-term effort that just needs to be recognized and supported, I think, largely by the community.
So, yeah, I'm going to turn to you now. It is a couple minutes after 9 o'clock, and so I think we need to start wrapping this up. It's been some time, Gray, Stephen, and Julie, since we turned to you all. So I'd like to turn to you for any final remarks you may have. But I think as we go around to our different panelists, I think in making any final remarks you may have, I know that you all have also been advocates for folks in the Sears Lane community as well as others in the unhoused community. And so the question that I would ask of you all in any final remarks you have, as well as our other panelists here, is to the extent there are other folks who want to reach out to you, either for your advocacy efforts or even to continue this discussion that we started tonight, I'd appreciate it if you could speak to how people may be able to reach you if you're open to that. So again, happy to turn to you for any final remarks, but then also would be happy to hear how folks can continue to engage.
So, I'm grateful for Joan mentioning support, and also the gentleman pointing at me when talking about where the problem is, and that I think I'd like to just give you a scenario that sort of illustrates how things are going in this conversation. I was at the camp the moments after the fence that was very expensive to build was put up around the camp. It's been useful. People can let their dogs walk in there now without them running out. A matter of hours after the fence went up, there was an individual from outside of the camp who came into the camp and was dragging a cart full of brand new tools that they had acquired. They went up to, I was standing at the entrance of at the gate, and so was Lacey. And this person came up to Lacey, had a nice conversation. And when I tried to engage this individual, Lacey said, "Stop, Gray. You have no part in this conversation. Go right ahead." And this person, who I stated was not from inside the camp, walked out of the camp with expensive equipment that had been purchased by one of our members who works every day to earn that money. And so I tried to figure out what to do about this. I talked to the other campers, and there was no vigilante justice. One of our members went over, had a conversation with this person, who, by the way, is also a person from outside the camp who is responsible for the fireworks, and who several times I've had to put out fires inside the camp because those fireworks have landed inside the camp. So I think that has a few examples of something that's repeatedly happened in this camp, where I've seen community come together, say, we're not going to do vigilante justice, we're not going to do carceral justice, we are going to talk to this person. And the tools came back, and peace was made. And that's how community works. you, sir, Chief, have said you represent yourself. I've seen you twice at the camp. I've had to introduce myself. And the last time we spoke, you said, I'm just walking through city land. I just came to you. I had to come over to you. I just to ask just what was the purpose, and you couldn't turn it even to look at me. And so I'm starting to see. I'm not a politician. I don't work in this political realm, but how there's a presentation of here's this liaison who, long before I came to Sears Lane, I've been warned about, and within the BIPOC community, I've been warned about, and how they've acted, and now I've seen how Lacey has acted, and yet here's this whole presentation. Well, the world's going to be better once we have more Lacey's, and once we have Lacey doing these things, and I've just seen gaslighting and deflating of autonomy, agency coming from this person. And I'm seeing the praise, and I'm hearing this praise, and it's honestly just it's what I expect in the political realm, but I see these opportunities just getting less and less, or the optimism being degraded by this person and by this type of talk. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the perspectives you put forward. Yeah, I'm just sort of I'm mindful of the time. I don't want to certainly cut people off, but I do also want to, if folks do want to follow up with you all, or
I've got a very short story.
Okay, sure.
Gentlemen, sir, can you tell me your name?
John.
John. I feel like you issued us an invitation, and I certainly would welcome a chance for us to talk more about.
Look, I agree that, yes, there's no mental health facilities. That's a big issue.
Why don't we talk after the
I also
meeting?
agree that not having affordable housing in the city is a huge issue, okay? There's a lot of things that we agree on, but you don't live it 24/7, okay? I do, okay? Me and my neighbor live it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, okay?
So it seems to me that respect is a mutual exchange.
Exactly.
And if you're looking for respect and we're looking for respect, why don't we get together and talk?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
And I've lived next to this for 10 years. I've never bothered them, okay?
Well,
but I get bothered all the time.
We would like to have that conversation with you.
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'll just say something as briefly as I can, just responding to a couple of things that were said, that together with Houseless Friends, I've done de-escalation, mutual aid, run an emergency housing network, and done extensive mental health support for community members. And all of those were only effective when police were not involved, because that's the only way that people felt safe. And I also just wanted to say something on behalf of my friend Saguino, who couldn't be here, that he has the determination to make a community without criminal activity, and where people respect rules, and where people have chances to come back again. And that, yeah, he lives there, and he has an intention of making a community that truly works and thrives and cares and loves for each other. Thanks.
So I guess my last word is Chip and Joan, Mr. Murad. We want to be in conversation with you. Do not have negotiations and discussions on the second floor of the city hall about us without us. Call us, get us in the room, let's devise a plan, let's make something that will work, that maximizes freedom and minimizes danger and illegal behavior.
Thank you for being here. I greatly appreciate that willingness, and to the extent our NPA can be any assistance in facilitating discussions, I think I can offer that up on behalf of our steering committee. If there's a brief comment right there, happy to take it. Yeah.
What I have to say is, if the motorcycle noise and the all-night noise was happening on my street, I also live in Lakeside. I'd be calling the police and I'd probably get a response. When John calls, they just won't put him through. So there is a difference.
Yeah.
And he's been living this.
Feeling like a criminal when
haven't.
calling the police is a terrible thing.
Would you say?
Feeling like a criminal when you call the police, being made to feel like
I
a
didn't
criminal.
say feeling like a criminal. I said if the
John said-
noise was on my street, I'd be calling the police because they have laws that say the noise is supposed to stop at 10 o'clock.
Yeah, and I'll come around to the chief to ask that question. I do want to just go around for some final remarks here. Professor Saguino, it's been some time since we came to you. Greatly appreciate your being here to the extent, if you have any final remarks, if we could keep them brief, and as well, in your role as the police commission, if folks want to engage with the commission. I should mention, of course, there's not, like the city council, one commissioner for each ward, but we do have 2 members on the police commission who live in Ward 5 as well, Jabu and Susie Comerford, who wanted to be here tonight, but could not. Susie's a professor at UVM and had a class to teach, and Jabu is working tonight. So appreciate your being here, but if folks wanted to engage with the commission, if you could mention that as well in your remarks.
Great. First of all, I just want to speak to the heart that I saw with people speaking tonight and listening, and it has been deeply informative for me, and I hope we have more of this. You asked, Ben, the important question about what we do, what can we do, and I want to suggest a few things. We recently had the Talitha report that described what the community is looking for in terms of public safety. We've had the CNA report that has given us a host of recommendations that have not yet been processed. I really urge the powers that be to engage with that report and take the action to change the policies, to put the systems in place. But I would like to say this, there's an enormous amount of talent, intelligence in this city, and caring in the city. And amongst economists, what we don't call it vigilantism, we call it solidarity economics. And I think then there are ways to build solidarity. I can't sit here and define to you what other communities have done or what research has been done on this, but we have the University of Vermont up the road. Many of us do this work. We are in touch with other communities, and what we need is a sustained focus on these issues and a path forward. And that has to be done. Obviously, the state should take a responsibility, but we can't control that. But it has to be the city and city government and city council. So I think there are solutions. I just want to be very optimistic about this. I have seen transformations here, not only in the United States, but in other countries that have taken on these issues and changed their communities. And we can do this. We have the resources and we have the values to do this. And what it requires is a sustained effort. We have a housing summit, a mental health summit. There needs to be a sustained focus. I recently was listening to a program in which the discussion was around poverty, and the statement was made that resonates with me, who does work on this, that poverty is a policy choice. In some ways, the chaos that we are experiencing is a choice, and that we can make a choice to focus our incredible intellectual and social resources on solving this. And what it needs is a sustained focus, and it needs the leadership to be the convener in the bully pulpit to move us all together. And I think we can do that.
Thank you.
I will be more brief than Commissioner Saguino. Thank you
Pretty
for,
brief,
for, for the invitation, but to follow up, the conversation will continue. The CNA report was 100+ recommendations. We've been very focused on one, which is the authorized cap, but the council did refer the remainder of the recommendations in the CNA report to the Public Safety Commission, and I expect there will be a report back on, like, how do we manage 100 recommendations with a proposed timeline? So I expect this conversation to be ongoing for the indefinite future on many of these issues. And I have a process question. How will we be able to see the chat and the Q&A? Because we've been focused on the room. I haven't been able to track what's.
I was actually going to ask Bridget before we left, if we could keep it open so we can see if we can copy and paste the chat out of there and put it in another document.
I mean, put the chat up on the.
I'm just, because I'm sure there are some questions in there where people might like answers that some of us may be able to provide.
Yes, so I was actually thinking that,
Okay.
and let's before we log out, try to copy and paste it and put it in a document, and happy to share it with the panelists.
Thank you very much.
John?
I think I've really said everything that I need to say, and I'm grateful for you coordinating this meeting and creating the opportunity for everybody to come in the room together. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Couldn't have done it without my MPA colleagues, so happy for them as well, particularly Andy. Thanks very much for your help in putting this together.
Thank you very much for a very balanced meeting, what's your role?
I guess moderator, so to speak.
Moderator, very balanced moderation, thank you so much.
I'll go to the Chief Tiff. I saw you raise your hand. Representative Bloomley, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, I totally agree. This was really helpful to hear, and I think a really important process. I guess I just want to say, Commissioner Saguino, that I think the state has a lot to, we have a responsibility to provide the resources that communities need, that we have not invested in for a long time. And I know that there are a lot of discussions right now, pre-session, that relate to mental health care reform, and that's not my jurisdiction. I'm on a housing committee, and that's been a big source of conversation, and I'm working with some Representative Chena and Kalaki and Pugh to really try to explore what exactly what you all were talking about, Stephen and Gray. And so at any rate, I just want to make sure that, like, we're not off the hook. In fact, we have some shoring up to do that we have not done.
And Chief Murad, we've gone, as we usually do at MPA meetings, about 20 minutes over, so but that's early. But any final remarks from you? And I guess another question I would have, right, is I think one of the things we've heard, and some of the questions that we got before then, right, is that folks unsure because of the discussion that's been out there with respect to staffing levels and the ability of the police department to respond or not. You know, there's some unsureness of folks of, there's something going on in my community, do I even call 911? Like, who do I call? Who is the resource that's available? And so I guess if you could, in your remarks, touch on that briefly from your perspective. And again, you know, I think we need to own that that's not the answer for everyone, right? But for those folks who are seeking the services of the police department, do you have an answer for them as to who to call?
I do. So I'm a resident of the city too. I live in the New North End, and we have certain quality of life issues that we deal with in our neighborhood, not like the ones that you're describing, John, but there are nevertheless issues that everyone feels. Quality of life is one of the most important things we can do. My definition of what police are is that police exist to keep people safe by preventing and responding to crime and disorder with and for their neighbors. That's the definition. We exist to keep people safe by preventing and responding to crime and disorder with and for our neighbors. And there are times right now, because of staffing, where response to disorder is going to be delayed or not possible even. But we have to know that those things are still happening, or else we end up with the phenomena that both the counselors are speaking of, which is that the data does not really reflect how people feel. Now, some degree of that lack of reflection is driven by problems with the data. Other parts are driven by the fact that the feelings that people have right now are challenged by the pandemic, as Councilor Shannon said, by things that are happening just to all of us. As Andy said, there's a lot of fear in this country right now. There is fear of the pandemic. There is fear of whether or not we are getting along with one another. There is fear of unrest. There's fear of how the political divide is worsening. People have fear of crime and see it happening in different places. For me, I want people to call when they experience these things, because we can't address what we don't know. And even if we can't address certain things, we still need to know about them so that we can try to prioritize what we do encounter and ultimately try to handle. And getting our number is the first piece. That's a census, whether it's a census of people or a census of data, is a very that's why it's in one of the first parts of our Constitution, the idea of our numbers and counting our numbers and knowing what we are and who we are. And a component of that is also knowing what's happening. And so I really beg that people report what Councilor Mason talked about with regard to some of these crimes in the South End not getting reported is frustrating to us, because we can't determine where our resources are best allotted if we don't have that data. And I'm imploring both to the folks there and to the folks there that we want to hear these things, and we will do our utmost to respond. Austin, Texas, which is down 17% in its head count, we are down 32%. Austin, Texas has unilaterally said they will not respond to what we would call priority 3 calls. We are not doing that. We are not unilaterally saying that we're not going to do it. The CNA report suggested that we should. The CNA report said we should stop responding to priority 3s just out of hand. I am not willing to do that yet. There are times where we can't because of resources, but I don't want to give up on quality of life, because quality of life is the key to good policing. It is the key to a safe community. When you have a handle on that, you have a handle on the big stuff too. And I am hurt that we can't always get the same handle on it that we have before. I want to get us back to a place where we can. And part of that is working with neighbors. It's not just about the police. It's about so many other parts. But we can't do it if we don't know it. So I beg people to report the things that they encounter. And I will do my best to make certain that when reported, we get a better kind of reaction. That's an arrow in the building.
All right. Well, thank you, Chief. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Joan, Chip, Stephanie. Thank you as well to Stephen, Gray, and Julie for being here. Look forward to the opportunity for some folks to continue the conversation offline, and for us as an NPA to continue the conversation here and as a community. So I'm really glad we were able to do this, and appreciate your all's participation. And
thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
Supper?
I missed supper too.